The job market this year is unreal. It's honestly terrifying. But in reality, it's almost impossible to find a decent job. He still hadn't found a job. Look closely at these scenes. What you see are not beggars. They are not addicts or criminals. They are young engineers, teachers, and white-collar workers who graduated from China's best universities. What we are witnessing in China is not just a routine reflection of a crisis at the heart of the global economy. It is the most frightening sociological collapse modern history has ever seen. These young people were touted as the bright future of the Chinese dream. They cannot go home. They cannot board trains. They cannot even buy a bottle of water. Xi Jinping's promise of common prosperity has now turned into an inescapable digital nightmare, a panopticon prison for more than 50 million young people. Was it these young people's fault? No, Xi Jinping fired this weapon at himself. The latest images that have reached us, managing to bypass China's strict censorship wall, slap us in the face with the horrific truth Beijing is trying to hide. Posters scream that millions have been blacklisted, declared debtors by court order. But this is not just an economic crisis. This is a silent mutiny, and now this ghost army quietly growing in Beijing's streets is awakening as a threat to the CCP's authority far greater than tanks and missiles. The roots of this human catastrophe are not ideological but mathematical. It all began with the colossal $300 billion collapse of China's real estate giant Evergrande. This was not just the bankruptcy of a company, but also the death knell for the artificial growth model that Beijing had been pumping for years. Until that day, Evergrande had been living like a true debt addict. It was constantly taking on new debt to pay off old debts and generating cash flow by selling homes that had not even been built yet. However, Beijing suddenly turned off the tap, declaring, "This mountain of debt now threatens the regime." When the administration turned off the taps with its 3 red lines policy, Evergrande's oxygen tube was cut off. The engine they were trying to cool down exploded in their hands. The construction sector, which accounts for 30% of China's economy, entered the biggest liquidity crisis in history in the fall of 2025 and pulled the plug. Bloomberg data and reports from the field confirm that the crisis peaked in October. The Xi administration tried to pump money into the market to resolve the crisis. But these stimulus packages vanished into a massive black hole. The decline in housing prices deepened because there was no trust left. As major construction holdings defaulted on their debts and filed for bankruptcy one after another, they left behind not only piles of concrete, but also millions of angry victims who had invested their life savings in that concrete. This is the collapse of a classic Ponzi scheme. People cannot sell their homes because there are no buyers. Construction companies cannot complete the homes because the coffers are empty. Unfinished projects, undelivered apartments, and yet the mortgage payments demanded by the banks. It was at this point that the great rift between the CCP rule and Chinese youth occurred. Young people launched the largest act of civil disobedience in modern Chinese history, a mortgage boycott declaring, "I will not pay the loan for a ghost house that I have not received, do not live in, and will never be completed." This boycott did not just open a hole in the bank's balance sheets. It opened an irreparable hole in the legitimacy of Xi Jinping's authority. October data shows that the incentives have failed and the crisis continues to drag on. The state's response, rather than producing an economic solution, was to start a financial war against its own people. To understand the mechanics of this disaster, we must look at the social credit system. This system, described in Western media as Orwellian, is no longer a loyalty program where you collect points and earn discounts. It is now a state trap. Xi Jinping, using this crisis as an excuse, began to deliberately create a lower class of people through the social credit system, that is, to establish a modern serfdom system. The process operates with an alarmingly simple and inevitable algorithm. It all begins with the harsh economic reality of 2025. Imagine a young person. He has graduated from university, found a job, and like every individual in China, has invested his future in a home. But when the real estate market collapses and the construction company goes bankrupt and flees, there is no home left and no money. All that remains is a massive debt to the bank. And when that young person exercises their most basic right, boycotting by saying, "I won't pay for a home I never received," they face the system's cold, hard reality. You can't ride the subway because your ID number triggers a red light at the turnstile. You can't take the high-speed train to visit your family. You can't even book a simple hotel room. In other words, China's social credit system no longer works to ensure justice, but to institutionalize helplessness. According to 2025 data, more than 200,000 new young people were added to this blacklist simply because of contract disputes and debt objections. The system labels them as lie, meaning untrustworthy individuals. What began with whispers has turned into a tragedy, affecting 5 to 6 million people today. The National Bureau of Statistics, or NBS, stated in its latest report dated November 14, 2025, that the economy is generally stable, but this is a complete lie. Look at the data they themselves published. The youth unemployment rate hit a historic high of 18.8% in August. In September, this figure was manipulated down to 16.1%. Even these improved rates mean that approximately 12.5 million young people in Chinese cities are officially unemployed right now. This means that a crowd, larger than the entire population of Greece or Belgium, is out on the streets rendered dysfunctional. But the truly alarming part is what the report does not mention. The NBS has removed from its statistics those participating in the Tangping movement, meaning those who have given up hope and stopped looking for work. When we add this group, the real army of unemployed is estimated to exceed 15 million. This is where the danger for Xi Jinping begins. These 15 million young people are not just unemployed. They are the disappointment of the 11.88 million new university graduates who will graduate. In 2025, Xi promised them jobs. In return, he gave them only debt, blacklists, and censorship. You can play with statistics. You can color the cells in Excel spreadsheets, but you cannot satisfy a hungry and angry crowd with these. Xi Jinping thought he could control the Evergrande crisis, that he could put out this fire by arresting a few CEOs and injecting some liquidity into the market. What a huge mistake. When the real estate market collapsed, it wasn't just an economic data point. It was the breaking of the backbone of Chinese society. And instead of treating this fracture, Beijing chose to punish the patient. That was the moment the dominoes began to fall. This is a strangulation operation. When young people stopped paying, the state responded by blacklisting them. But what Beijing failed to calculate was this: you cannot threaten someone who has nothing left to lose. What meaning could loyalty to the party possibly hold for a young person in this situation? The situation on the ground is evolving into a silent civil war. The hardworking, obedient youth, who were once the engine of the Chinese miracle, are now pulling the plug on the system. At this point, the Tangping movement has gone from being a passive lifestyle to an active and destructive resistance, a let-it-rot philosophy. Millions of young people are not only refusing to pay mortgages, they are refusing to marry, refusing to have children, refusing to consume. The real estate sector, which accounts for 30% of China's economy, is buckling under the weight of this boycott, and Jinping's dream of a great rejuvenation is also buried under the rubble. This digital quarantine imposed by Beijing on its own citizens is actually a bullet fired by the regime into its own economy. Excluding 15 million young people from the system means devastating the consumer economy. An algorithm is sabotaging China's demographic and economic future by turning taxpayers, consumers, and future parents into homeless individuals. This is not an attack from outside. It is the system's own immune system attacking the body. We must pause here and look at the big picture. That strategic checkmate position. Jinping's rule has for years been based on a single unwritten social contract. But today what we see on China's streets, under bridges and on censored social media channels, is the tearing up of that contract in front of millions of eyes. Xi's total control strategy has opened a massive hole in his own legitimacy. The cornering of young people with unemployment, mortgage crises, and blacklist penalties has shattered the myth that the CCP is the protector of the people. Why are these boycotts and protests the greatest threat to the CCP? Because they are organized, because they come from an educated crowd, and most importantly, they are desperate. History teaches us that revolutions are born not from starving peasants, but from the middle class, educated youth whose dreams have been stolen and whose status has been taken away. Beijing is currently in panic mode. New stimulus packages are being announced. Housing subsidies are being discussed, but it's all too late. According to reports from Freedom House and human rights organizations, the protests are not just saying, "Give us our money." They are now shouting their anger at the system itself. At Jinping's one-man rule, the Great Firewall cannot stop this flood of anger. However, the social credit system he established has blown up the country's internal security, social fabric, and the people's trust in the state. This situation is a paradox for Xi Jinping. The tighter he tightens the system, the more people he pushes outside the system. Authoritarian regimes rule through fear. But the social credit system has exhausted fear. So what can you use to intimidate a young person who is now homeless, penniless, and without a future? Imprisonment. They are already living in an open-air prison in a digital cell. Xi Jinping is watching in horror as the surveillance architecture he built to consolidate his power has now turned into a molehole undermining his regime. This is not an economic downturn, but the moment of collapse of political legitimacy. Ultimately, the social credit system was designed to bring the Chinese people into line to create a society of perfect obedience. But in the end, the greatest weapon destroying the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party is this system itself. 50 million homeless, jobless, futureless, and most importantly, angry young people. This is not a warning, but an observation. The dragon has bitten its own tail and been poisoned, so what do you think about this? Please share your thoughts in the comments. To stay updated on new videos, please subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Thank you for watching.